Hello, this is Mark from Excel Off the Grid. In this video I want to show you how to connect slicer selections to standard Excel formulas. Slicers are a great tool for adding user interactivity. Natively they only work with pivot tables, pivot charts, tables and cube functions. Now pivot tables, pivot charts and tables lack the flexibility that we can achieve when using formulas. And the cube functions, well, they're only available when using the data model. So how can we bring the power of slicers to standard formulas? Well, let's find out. If you want to work along with this video, then you can find links and instructions on how to download the example file in the descriptions box below. So once you've done that, if you're ready, let's get started. Now before we go any further, I just want to remind you that if you've not already done so, to subscribe and get notifications so that you don't miss a single video. The basic functionality of connecting slicer selections to formulas is quite easy. But as we go further through the examples in this video, it'll start to get quite technical. And as you'll see, it's more about our skill with formulas than it is about our ability to connect the slicer to the formula. So to help us with this, I want to consider some core Excel terminology. And the thing I want us to understand first is the term scalar. The word scalar is used to describe an argument within a function where Excel is expecting a single value. The easiest way to understand this is probably with some examples. So that's what we're going to look at now. So here we have our data on the left, and we're going to look at examples using VLOOKUP, SUMIFs, COUNTIF, and also a reverse COUNTIF. So let's start with VLOOKUP, because that's probably the most common function that most of us know. So here we are in cell I7, and we'll create a standard VLOOKUP function. So type equals VLOOKUP, open bracket, and we'll select a single lookup value. That is known as the scalar. We'll select the value in H7, which is hotel. We'll enter a comma, and then we'll select the table array. And this is the range of cells from which we want to look up the word hotel and also return our value. So I'll select A2 and go all the way down to E27, enter a comma, and we'll find the value in column E, which is the fifth column. And I want an exact match, so I'll type a 0 and then close the bracket and press return. And there we see that when we look up hotel, it returns the value 85. And in that example, hotel is our scalar. Now what happens if instead of just providing one value hotel, we provide 4 values? So let's have a look at this next. So in cell I10, I'll type equals VLOOKUP, open bracket, and now rather than one value, we're going to select 4 values. Comma, we'll select the same table array as before, A2 to E27, comma, column 5, an exact match, so 0 or false. So if you've got a dynamic array enabled version of Excel, when we press enter, it will calculate a VLOOKUP for each of the values from H10 to H13. And there we have it. Hotel is 85, Mike is 105, Romeo is 60, Victor is -20. Now even if you've not got a dynamic array enabled version of Excel, it would still calculate all of these values in the background. So when we talk about scalars, or in this example multiple scalars, whether you've got a newer version of Excel or a traditional version of Excel, it doesn't matter. All of our examples will still work in the same way. Now let's try this with SUMIFs. So let's head up into cell J7, equals SUMIFs, open bracket. Now the first argument in SUMIFs is the sum range. So I'll select E2 to E27, place a comma, then the second argument is the criteria range. So I'll select A2 to A27, enter a comma, and then the selection criteria, and I'll select over here on H7 the value hotel, close bracket, and press enter. Now not surprisingly, because we've got unique values in column A, that calculates as 85. Let's try this again in cell J10. SUMIFs, sum range, comma, the criteria range, comma, and we're going to provide multiple scalar values. So all the way from hotel down to Mike, Romeo and Victor, close that bracket. I'll press return, and as you can see, all of those values are calculated. Again, if you've got a traditional version of Excel, it's not a problem. Excel is calculating these in the background. And we'll be using SUMIFs in a few minutes. That's why we've used that as an example. When we get into the more advanced workings, we'll also be using COUNTIF. So let's have a look at that. And we'll look at that in cell K7. Equals COUNTIF, open bracket. So the range that we're going to look at, A2 to A27, comma, and the scalar of H7, hotel, close the bracket. Unsurprisingly, it's the answer of 1. Now let's have a look where we've got multiple scalars. So in cell K10 equals COUNTIF, open bracket, the range, comma, the multiple scalars. So it'll calculate one for each of those, press enter, and as you can see, all of those match. But the thing I really want to show you here is if we use a reverse COUNTIF. So here we've used 4 scalars and we get 4 results. If we do a reverse COUNTIF, we can get 26 results, one for each of our customers in the cells A2 to A27. So let's try that. So equals COUNTIF, open bracket. Now this time my range is going to be what previously were the scalars, and my criteria is going to be my customers. When I press return on that, as you can see, it returns all the values for all of our customers. You can see which ones have a match and which ones don't. Okay, now we've covered the concept of scalars, let's move on to look at a basic example and then see how we can make that more complicated so we end up with not just one slicer but multiple slicers all used with standard Excel functions. So we'll start by clicking on the SUMIFs single slicer tab if you're working along with the example file. Here we have the same data, so we have our customer, our location, our sales rep, our customer type and our value. Now in this first example we want to use a slicer on the sales rep column so that we can select whether it's Donna, Dave or Karen, and from that it will then adjust the result of our formulas. Now as I said at the start, slicers don't work with standard Excel functions, which means that we have to pull a little bit of Excel trickery. So let's start by creating a pivot table. We'll select our entire data range there and then we'll select Insert, Pivot Table. We'll choose to have it in the existing worksheet and we'll enter it in cell N3 and click OK. So that's just a standard pivot table, and because we want to use a slicer on the sales rep, we're going to select sales rep and drag that into the rows column. Now here we have a unique list of all of our sales reps. So the next thing we want to do is just take off the grand total. That doesn't serve us any benefit. Right click, pivot table options, totals and filters, remove both of those and then click OK. Then to add the slicer with our pivot table selected, we'll be on the pivot table analyze tab and then insert slicer. As I said, we want to use our slicer with our sales rep, so let's select that and then click OK. And there we have our slicer. Let's just position that. I'll hold Alt to make it snap to the grid. Perfect. Now we've got the options of Dave, Donna or Karen. And as we select those, as you'll notice, the pivot table just displays the value that is selected. So if we come up here in cell I6, we can then enter a SUMIFs function. Equals SUMIFs, open bracket, the sum range, cells E2 to E27, where our location, B2 to B27, is equal to Birmingham. And then our second criteria, where our sales rep is equal to Karen, or the cell N4, which is the result of the pivot table. Close the bracket on that. I need to add some dollars in here. The only one that's not is H6. So we can freeze the column but not the row. Press enter on that and we drag that down. Now we should be able to select between our sales reps, and that will then calculate the sales for each sales rep at each location. We can then add a formula here to show the selection that we've got. So equals double quote sales rep colon space close double quote ampersand select cell N4, press return, and now also our selection criteria is shown there. So the next question that comes to mind is, what if we have multiple selections? What happens if someone selects Dave and Donna? We can allow multiple selections, and when we have Dave and Donna, or even click Karen, as you can see, those additional selections have no impact on our SUMIFS function, and that's because we've only given it one scalar. We've given it a single value, and that is the value in N4, which currently says Dave. So if we want to use multiple selections, our formulas have to become a bit more advanced. So let's try this in cell I20. Equals SUMIFS, open bracket, our sum range is cell E2 to E27, comma, our first selection range is B2 to B27, and our selection criteria is Birmingham, comma, our second selection range is C2 to C27, comma, and then our selection criteria, we can select all of those three rows. Or if we thought there were going to be more sales reps in the future, we could select more rows. We'll close that bracket and I'll press return. Now that function has returned three values. And again, because I have a dynamic array enabled version of Excel, it shows those three values. It's showing the value for Dave, Donna and Karen. If I were to select just one of those values, as you can see, the result of the function changes. So if I come in here and wrap this in a sum function, what Excel does is now sums those three values. So rather than displaying the three values from the SUMIFS, it then sums the value from the SUMIFS. So when I select any of the values or multiple values, it sums all of those. Okay, let's come in here and add some dollars on those. And again, we'll drag those down so that when we make selections, it's actually adding up all three values. If you don't have a dynamic array enabled version of Excel, what you can do is turn this into an array formula. So we click on our formula and we can press Ctrl, Shift and Enter. And what that will do is wrap our formula in curly brackets, and we can drag that down. And even though you're in an older version of Excel, these selection criteria still work. An alternative, instead of using the sum function, you can use a function which handles arrays natively, such as sum product. We'll press return on that, and when we drag that down, that will continue to work with our multiple selections. So sum product in this example avoids needing to press Ctrl Shift Enter on a standard sum function. So there, in that example, we've seen how to use SUMIFS with multiple scalars. So how do we know which sales reps have been selected? Well, let's come over here. Equals sales reps, or sales rep, colon, space, in double quotes, put an ampersand, so text, join, open bracket, it asks for my delimiter, which I want as a comma and a space. Ignore empty, I want that to be true. Comma, and then the text, and I'm going to select the same cells as I selected as my scalars before. So I'll select those, N4 to N6, close bracket, press enter. And as you can see, I've got sales reps of Dave, Donna and Karen. And if I just select one or multiple selections, as you can see, that cell displays which sales reps have been selected. Now if I stopped there and published this video at that point, I know that somebody would contact me and say, well, I've got multiple slicers. What do I do with that? Well, that's what we're going to move on to next. So click on the SUMIFS Multiple Criteria Slicer tab if you're working along with the example. Okay, we've got our same data, but we're going to create two slicers, one for sales rep and one for customer type. So for this, we'll need two pivot tables. So let's start by selecting our data, cells A2 to E27, then click Insert Pivot Table, select Existing Worksheet, and we'll go cell N3, and then click OK. And we'll put sales rep in our rows again. Right click, Pivot Table Options, Totals and Filters, and remove the totals from there and click OK. Now we can copy that, Control C, click someone else, Control V, and with that pivot table selected, rather than sales rep, we want to see the customer type. And our customer types have either premium or standard. So let's create slicers for both of those. Select our pivot table, and click Pivot Table Analyze, Insert Slicer. This first one is for sales rep. Click OK. We'll hold Alt to snap to the grid while we position that. Select our second pivot table, Pivot Table Analyze, Insert Slicer. This time we want customer type. Click OK. Again, we'll drag that into a suitable position to allow multiple selections on those. And when we click our slicer, it then filters our pivot table. And that's also the same with our customer type. Because we now have multiple criteria with the potential for multiple scalars, we can't use the SUMIFS function anymore. SUMIFS is a powerful function, but in this scenario, it's too simplistic for what we need. Instead, we're going to have to use some Boolean logic, which is true and false, to create a function ourselves, an array function. So let's start here in cell I7. Equals. I'm going to start with the COUNTIF function. And we saw this right at the start. And we'll begin with our location. So we'll select Birmingham, comma, select B2 to B27. Let's put some dollars on those now. And we'll close that bracket. Now when I press return on that, as we saw before, because we've done a reverse COUNTIF, it calculates all the values. So we can see every cell where the result is Birmingham. We have some ones and some noughts here, and these are exceptionally useful because of the way basic maths works. Any number multiplied by a 0 is always 0. But anytime we get a 1 multiplied by a 1, the value is always 1. Which means we know when two values are both true. Because if they're both true, a 1 and a 1 gets multiplied together. But anytime we only have a single value that's true, it will be a 1 multiplied by a 0 or a 0 multiplied by a 1, which means that the ultimate result will be 0. So if we add in a second selection criteria, select cell I7 again, and then we will multiply that by another COUNTIF. Now again, we want all the values from the table on the left. So we're going to do a reverse COUNTIF. So we'll select the values from N4 to N6, add some dollars on those, comma, and then select C2 to C27. Add some dollars, close the bracket. Now if we start to use our sales rep selections, so if we were to just select Dave and unselect the others, so if we look down that list of zeros and ones, we see there is a 1, and that 1 is in the 13th position in that list. If we look down our list of data, we'll see the value of Birmingham and Dave equally exist in that 13th position. So that's row 14. And we can see the other values of 1 also are Birmingham and Dave in those equivalent positions. So by using this multiplication logic, what we have is the slicer driving the result of the functions. Let's select all of those again. And we'll add another COUNTIF. So multiply, COUNTIF. And we'll use the same trick again. We'll select premium and standard. And rather than a single scalar as the criteria, we're going to select all the cells from D2 to D27. And if we were to look at the result of that, we would only see where the location matches, the sales rep matches, and the customer type matches. So if we were to multiply that by the values in E2 to E27, put some dollars on there, close that bracket, and press return. There we have all the values that match Birmingham and the selection of Dave, Donna and Karen, and the customer type of premium or standard. If we were to just select standard, as you can see, we now only have the results which are standard customers. So let's reselect premium and let's wrap this in a sum function and press return. And depending on what we select, as you can see, our formula value changes. If you have a traditional version of the Excel functions, rather than sum, you'd have to use sum product, or press Ctrl+Shift+Enter to get that to calculate, and then you could drag that down to each of those. And each of those slices would work to drive the results of the formula. Okay, so to finish this off, let's add our selection criteria once again. So we have our sales rep, use our text join once again, comma space, ignore blanks with true, we can do the same for our customer type. Text join once again, open bracket, my delimiter is a comma space, ignore blanks or empty, true, and select our options there, close that up, press return. And now not only do our slicers drive the results of our formulas, but we can also see exactly what selections have been made, which means that if this is printed out on paper, we can still see which selections were made to drive the results. And there you have it. That's how we use slicer selections in formulas. We've seen how to use it for a single scalar, for multiple scalars, and finally we've used multiple slicers with multiple scalars. And for this we had to create some Boolean logic so that we can emulate the result that we would have got had we used a basic SUMIFS function. Well, that's it from me. If you like this video, don't forget to subscribe, like and comment, and I'll catch you next time.